So, welcome back to the virtual classroom. Clearly today it looks a little bit different because I am using a whiteboard type of setup because I thought it'd be a little bit more conducive to learning this particular topic than just looking upon my beautiful face as I speak. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about photosynthesis, about the overall workings of the processes of photosynthesis and the mechanisms that it uses to generate sugars from CO2 and sunlight. So the first thing we need to look at is the generic formula for photosynthesis, right? The reaction that occurs in this process. So we have the things going in, which are carbon dioxide and water. And we have the things coming out, which are sugar, glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen gas, O2. Okay. Now this reaction requires sunlight, but sunlight is not a physical molecule, so it doesn't belong over here with the reactants. Okay. It goes above this arrow. So anytime we have something that is needed for a reaction to occur, but isn't one of the actual reactants getting used up, we put it here above the reaction arrow. Okay. So the things going in are called reactants, because they are the things that are reacting, okay? And the things coming out are called the products. So this is our very general formula for photosynthesis. Okay? The plant is taking in carbon dioxide, taking in water, taking in sunlight, and it is putting out sugar in the form of glucose and oxygen gas. Okay? So that's our generic formula. I will be right back with a little bit of a modification to this. All right, so here we have the same general formula, but I've stretched it out so that I have a little bit of room to work. Now, when we do chemical reactions, right, we need to use all the stuff that we start with. Right? So when you're dealing with matter, you can't create matter and you can't destroy matter. So whatever goes in to this reaction has to come out of this reaction. The sides have to be balanced. Right? And so if I have 7 carbons go in, I have to have 7 carbons come out. That's just the rules of the universe. Okay? Now, if we look here, we can count our carbons very easily. I have 1 carbon going in. If I go over to the outside and I look how much carbon is coming out, I see that 6 carbons are coming out. So clearly this is not balanced. Now, when you balance chemical reactions, it can be a bit of a puzzle. For photosynthesis, it's actually really easy. And so we're going to start with carbon because it's the first thing we encounter. So I know that I have 1 carbon going in, but I have 6 carbons going out. So the easy way to remedy this is to say that I have 6 carbon dioxides going in. Right? So if you put the number in front of the molecule, it means I have this many carbon dioxides. So if I have 6 carbon dioxides, I have 6 carbons. But if I have 6 carbon dioxides, it means I now have 12 oxygens. And so that's something I have to account for on the other side as well. Okay. Let's move on to our oxygen count. So here I have 12, okay, and over here I have 1. So that means I have a total here of 13. Down here I have 6 and I have 2, so I only have 8. Right? So I have 13 up here and I have 8 down here. That's not an easy thing to balance out, right? 8 and 13 don't work well together, so I'm going to ignore that for now. Okay? I'm going to move into hydrogens. Here I have 2 hydrogens, and that's easy to see. And down here I have 12 hydrogens. Right? So if I want to make 2 hydrogens into 12 hydrogens, I again can say I have 6 waters. Okay? If I have 6 waters, that gives me 12 hydrogens. 12 hydrogens, I'm happy. This again, though, changes the amount of oxygens that I have going in. So here I have 12 oxygens going in. Here I have 6 more oxygens. That's a total of 18 oxygens that I'm dealing with here. So down here, I need to have 18 oxygens coming out. Here I have 6, and here I have 2. Okay? So I need 12 more, because this is 8 total. I need 12 more. Now, fortunately, oxygen's over here by itself, so this is really easy. If I have 6 oxygens, I now have 12 more oxygens, right? So if we count everything up, I have carbons up here. I have 6 carbons here. Okay. I have oxygens. I have 12 plus 6 is 18. Okay. And then hydrogens, I have 12. Okay. If I count it down here, carbons, I have 6. Oxygens, I have 6 plus 12 is 18. And then hydrogens, I have 12. Okay, so these numbers are the same as these numbers. This reaction is now balanced. So this CO2, right, so I have 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters yields 1 glucose and 6 oxygen gas molecules. This is our more accurate photosynthesis reaction formula. Now, the reality of it is there's actually a couple more waters and a couple more oxygens involved in this whole story, but because they cancel out, we just ignore them in our typical formula. Okay, cool. Moving on. So, quick look at the shapes of those reactants and those products that were involved in photosynthesis, because shape is important. Shape controls function, right? So we need to know their shapes. Over here, I have the reactants. This is water, H2O, H2O, and this is carbon dioxide. Okay. The double bonds in this carbon dioxide keep it nice and linear, so it's a very straight molecule, whereas the single bonds in this water allow it to bend like this, and that's what allows water to be polar, because this oxygen is highly electronegative, so it has a little bit of an electric charge up here, and down here has a little bit of a positive charge. Okay. Over on the product side, I'll start with the tiny guy. This is O2 gas. Okay, again, we see that double bond. Okay, so this is a linear, stiff molecule. There's not much flexibility around this bond. And here is sugar. Okay, this is a C6H12O6 molecule. You'll see it represented a little bit differently as I move forward, but for this time I wanted to draw out all of the carbons, okay, and all of the oxygens and all of the hydrogens. So this is what the totality of the glucose molecule looks like. So you'll notice that there are only 3 elements involved in this storyline. It's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Those are the building blocks of all of these molecules that we're looking at. Cool. So the totality of the processes of photosynthesis amount to 2 major steps. Each of these steps has their own minor steps in between, but at this level of biology, we do not need to explore them. Okay? So the 2 major steps of photosynthesis is the first step of light reactions and the second step of Calvin cycle. Okay? Light reactions occur in a place within the cell called the thylakoids. Okay? So that's where this is happening. And what is it doing? What it is doing, rather, is that it is using chlorophyll, a green pigment, to harness the sunlight energy. So it's harnessing energy from sunlight. Once it harnesses that energy, it creates a temporary storage molecule called NADPH to hold on to that energy and then pass that energy into the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle occurs second because it's waiting for that NADPH to operate. It uses the energy in that NADPH to rip off some carbons. But first, I should tell you where it happens. So it happens in the stroma, another spot within the cell. And we'll look at these in a second about what these things actually mean, thylakoids and stromas. But again, what it is doing is it's using the energy from this NADPH to rip the carbon in the CO2 off. Okay? So it has all these carbons now available, and then it's shoving those carbons together to form glucose. Okay? Combine the carbons with some oxygens and some hydrogens to form that sugar ring that I showed you a moment ago. Okay? And so that's the end game of photosynthesis, is to create this sugar ring. Along the way, you make oxygen gas as trash, what's called a byproduct, and then it just escapes into the atmosphere, or the plant uses it for cellular respiration. Okay? So this sugar is now made through these two steps. Again, the first step is light reactions. The second step is the Calvin cycle. Okay, so as far as the locations of these processes go, and we have to start at a macro level. And so we're talking about photosynthetic organisms. Typically, we're talking about plants. We could also be talking about algae. We could even be talking about photosynthetic bacteria. But for bacteria, this storyline would be a little bit different. Okay, so this is looking only at eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms. Okay, so this beautiful drawing here is a leaf, believe it or not. Okay, it's green because it's a leaf. Okay, and we zoom in on this leaf down to a cellular level. And I'm now at a plant cell. So this is a plant cell. You can tell it's a plant cell because I gave it a cell wall around its cell membrane. Okay? And then these green things that I've modeled here so artistically are the organelle that are responsible for photosynthesis. And they are called chloroplasts. And I've zoomed in on one singular chloroplast here, and then we can see these structures inside of the chloroplast. So this is where the level of thylakoids and stromas are occurring. It's inside of the organelle of the plant. So these are really tiny. These green stacks are the thylakoids. And they are basically just big stacks of membranes that have been coiled up into tight little packages, and they are packed full of the pigment chlorophyll. Now, chlorophyll's shape allows it to catch the energy from the sunlight because within its structure there is an electron that when the sunlight hits it, it gets excited and moves faster. And that's how it's harnessing the energy. So the increased speed of the electron is the higher energy state, and that's how we're transferring energy from sunlight into something physical. So the thylakoids, these green stacks, are where the light reactions are occurring. Okay? And the space between these thylakoids is the stroma. And the stroma is where the Calvin cycle is occurring. The analogy I like to use for this is that the thylakoids are like buildings in a big city, right? Like skyscraper type buildings, and the stroma is the space between the buildings. Okay? So if you imagine the buildings, the people are doing work inside and throwing stuff out of the windows, right? So the light reactions throw their products out of these thylakoids and they land in the stroma, and then they are used for the Calvin cycle. Okay? So plants with plant cell, organelle is chloroplast. Inside the chloroplast are thylakoids that contain chlorophyll, the green pigment that catches the sunlight to do the light reactions. The products of the light reactions are dumped into the stroma where they are used to do the Calvin cycle. Okay, so as I had mentioned before, the entire purpose of doing this process of photosynthesis was to generate this glucose molecule that you see on the screen in front of us. Now, if we look closely at this drawing, it is a little different than the one I had before. Okay? When we draw organic molecules, we ditch the drawing of the actual C's. So anytime you see these points, these pointy spots, they are representing carbons. Because carbons are so prevalent in all organic molecules, it's quicker to not draw them and just make the assumption. The same can be said of hydrogens where you have an empty spot. Okay? So we only draw the other elements that are not carbons or hydrogens attached to carbons. So we draw all of the oxygens, and we draw the hydrogens that are attached to the oxygens, but we don't draw the carbons, and we don't draw the hydrogens that are attached to the carbons. Okay, just a thing to know about organic molecule drawings. So this is my glucose. This is my sugar that we just made through photosynthesis. And there's two things that can be done with this glucose. The first thing that could be done is that the plant can use this simple carbohydrate, right, this one ring, to build up more complex carbohydrates. Ultimately, a lot of those are going to be going towards the cellulose of the plant. And the cellulose is the structural component of the plant. Cellulose is what makes the plant stiff. Obviously, they don't have any muscles or anything to hold themselves up, so they need these stiff molecules to keep them tight. Okay. And cellulose is just a bunch of sugar rings stuck together. So if you combine this sugar with another sugar, and then another sugar, and then another sugar, right, and you put them in the right order, you get a nice long stiff cellulose. So this original sugar can be used to build up cellulose. That's use one. The more common use that we think of is for energy. Right? So this sugar is like a bank for energy. Okay? Each of the bonds between these molecules, or rather between these elements, holds a little bit of the energy that we harnessed originally from the sunlight. And when we break these bonds apart, that energy is released to do work and such. So the analogy I use here is that the glucose is like a $100 bill. Right? And so if you have a $100 bill, it's a good amount of money. Right? You can go and you can buy some significant stuff with it. But if you go into the package store and you want a pack of gum, right, you don't want to bring your $100 bill. You need something smaller, like a 10, right? Or a 5, or a $1 bill, right? And so the glucose is the big money. Right? It stores a lot of money, but you can't use it as readily. Right? You can break it down into these smaller bills, and then you can actually use the smaller bills to buy stuff. So when it's time to get the energy to do work in the cell, we need the smaller bill. And the process that we use to break down the big sugar into these smaller units for energy is called cellular respiration, which I will cover in the next video specifically. So I'm not going to go into the details of that now. Nope. I'm just going to say that it basically breaks this down into halves. It splits it in half, and then it splits it down even further. Ultimately, it breaks it down into CO2 and H2O. And then it uses the energy that is released through that breakdown to generate ATP. And ATP is the actual molecule that our cells can use to do work. So like if it needs to throw some trash out, it uses a little bit of ATP to push that trash out, stuff like that. Okay. So two purposes for this carbohydrate within the plant is it can either build cellulose or it can be used to release energy and ultimately make ATP. Cool. All right, so the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video is the cycling of carbon and the role that photosynthesis plays in that specifically. All right, so the last video that we watched by the amoeba sisters went specifically into the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. Here I'm just going to focus on the role that photosynthesis plays in this whole little storyline. So you can see a tree here in the middle is our representative plant doing the photosynthesis. Okay? And the main thing it's doing is it's converting this atmospheric, inorganic carbon dioxide into this organic sugar that can be used by living things. Okay? So now there's a lot of sources of carbon dioxide going on here. Right? When this rabbit eats this sugar and then does cellular respiration, it releases carbon dioxide. That's one source. Okay? Someday, this rabbit's going to die. Dead rabbit gets decomposed by these decomposing bacteria that I've beautifully represented here. They're releasing some carbon dioxide as well. And then this dead stuff, right, will eventually turn into fossil fuels way down the line, right? So like our current fossil fuels are like from like the dinosaurs and stuff. So same idea though. So then the dead stuff that originally had sugar is now dead. We burn it in our factories. That releases more carbon dioxide. And ultimately, the storyline is we get all this carbon dioxide building up in the environment. And the only way to convert it back into something useful is through these processes such as photosynthesis. Right? And so these plants, or these algae, or these photosynthetic bacteria, are taking this inorganic carbon, converting it into something organic that living things can use, and then it cycles through over and over. Cool. That's it. So, talked a little bit about the structures involved in photosynthesis, which are the thylakoid and the stroma, which are found within the chloroplast, which is the organelle of the plant that contains the chlorophyll, which is the pigment used to actually catch the sunlight. The thylakoids are responsible for the process of light reactions, which are the first step of photosynthesis, and they pass their products to the second step of photosynthesis, which is the Calvin cycle. All that is done to generate a simple glucose molecule that can be used by the plant to generate cellulose as a structural component or by many organisms as a source of energy. Breaks down that glucose in the process of cellular respiration to generate ATP that the cells can then use. And that's it. I'm done. Hope you had fun. Have a great day. I will see you all in class. Bye.